And then I kind of acted. I heard about this Duncan machine, and there's really two factions of the Duncan machine. There was the Ed Bailey faction, and then there was the Mose Low Betty faction. And I always identified with the Ed Bailey faction. That's why Ed and I probably had to give comments to the New York Times reporter when Harold Ford Jr. and the other guy that was up in state representative running for Congress. Anyway, it don't matter. Anyway, that year that Ford was running against Corker, there was a couple of Democrats there, and of course Ed always blamed Mose for inviting the Democrats. But anyway, I really do feel like that if there is such a thing as the Duncan machine, I earned my stripes in the Duncan machine when Stephen Smith ran against my congressman. And every time Stephen Smith would be on talk radio, I'd pull over because I didn't have a cell phone back then. And I'd get on a payphone and I'd call and wear Stephen Smith out. And I understand the dude's still alive, by the way, but anyway, he's still a radical environmental extremist. But anyway, so I just asked Congressman Duncan to come speak to us, and he does have some books from Bat Boy to Congressman. So if you want a copy, then he's got them here. Miss Vicky's got them with him. And how much are they? 20? Are they 20? I don't remember.
No,
I don't remember.
They used to charge me $20 for them, but now
Okay.
now they come down. They charge me $12.50.
Okay.
But anybody who wants one, I'll give it to you for $10 to
Okay.
make it simple.
Well, there you go.
Even.
All right.
Thank you.
All right, Congressman Duncan, come up and talk to us.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, Brian, thank you. And Brian, I have known Brian since he was a very young man, and I appreciate him, and I appreciate all of you here tonight. And I have to tell you, I really admire Buddy being here. No offense to anybody else, but to lose an election and then come to still come and be a loyal Republican, that's really admirable, I think. And
Thank you, sir.
I'm here with my wife, Vicki, and some of you know that Vicki and I, Vicki lost her husband to Lou Gehrig's disease 7 months before I lost my wife, Lynn, to 2 strokes and cancer. And but Vicki and I knew each other as toddlers in the nursery at Park City Presbyterian Church, a block off of Magnolia. We've known each other all of our lives. She has told people that we slept together before we were 3.
You know, Ricky.
4 years ago, we got remarried. The minister said that it was the first time he'd married a couple with 97 years of marriage between them. But I feel greatly blessed and very, very lucky in a lot of ways. In fact, when I think back, I just can't believe how fortunate I've been. I worked as I sold Prokes and popcorns at the UT games, but then I got a job for $1.10 an hour as a bag boy at the A&P grocery store on Asheville Highway, and I sent my first paycheck, $19 and some odd cents, to the Barry Goldwater campaign. I went to I rode a train for 77 hours and went to the 1964 Republican Convention, where I was an honorary assistant sergeant at arms. And I've said you can't get any lower than being an honorary assistant. That's what I was. And in fact, Susan Williams and I both figured that we were the only 2 people at the 2024 convention who had been at the 64 convention. And she was a page at that same convention in 1964. I then worked 2 summers, 67 and 68, in the Nixon for President campaign, and the campaigns were a lot smaller back then. In 67, there were about 22 or 23 people working at a little building that I can't believe lasted as long as it did, a half a block from the White House on Pennsylvania Avenue, and it only had 2 stories and a basement. And Nixon fired Dr. Gaylord Parkinson, who had been the California state chairman, who became his national chairman. Nixon fired him in the middle of the 67 season, and he hired Congressman Bob Ellsworth from Kansas, who had lost a race for the Senate. Bob Ellsworth came down there to the headquarters that first day And he came over to me and he said, "What I'm about to say doesn't apply to you, so sit tight and keep quiet." And I thought, golly, I'm getting left out of this. And then he turned around and he says, "You're all fired." And everybody was in shock. But then the only other college student was a boy named Mark Pfeiffer from Columbus, Indiana, who went to Dartmouth, and he'd gotten there at 8:30 that morning, and this firing took place at 10 o'clock, and I'll never forget him saying that, his hometown newspaper in Columbus, Indiana, had a front page story the day before about him coming to work for the Nixon committee, and now he's here not even 2 hours and he gets fired. But I will tell you that he and I were the only 2 college students. They kept me and Mark Pfeiffer, the 2 college students, and the switchboard operator on. And I've said ever since then, I wasn't even high enough up in the campaign to get fired. But I came back from working in the Nixon campaign in '68. They wanted me to stay on as a field manager through the campaign, but I did that for a couple of weeks, and then I wanted to get on back and finish my senior year at UT. I came back and somebody anonymously sent me the minutes from the Issues Committee, which the Issues Committee controlled many thousands of dollars, bringing in outside speakers. And that year they had invited Angela Davis, who was a famous communist, Tom Hayden, who was Jane Fonda's husband. The most conservative speaker they had invited was Hubert Humphrey, who was the Democrat nominee for president. So I got mad, and I wrote this column. I had been a weekly columnist for the Beacon the year before. I was the token conservative on the UT Daily Beacon my junior year. I wrote a column blasting that and listing 15 very respectable conservative speakers like William F. Buckley and many others. Took it to the editor, who was a liberal from the Nashville, Tennessee, and he refused to print it. He said my column was supposed to be on national issues, and that was a campus issue. I took it down to Guy Smith, who was the editor of the Knoxville Journal, and he had opposed my dad in 3 races for mayor, and I grew up thinking Guy Smith was the devil himself. But anyway, the Journal was the more conservative of the papers then, and I took it up to him. He was very unsmiling, unfriendly, didn't give me any encouragement. He said he'll take a look at it. And the next morning, which was a Saturday morning in UT football Saturday, where the circulation of the Journal went up from 77,000 to 82,000, I was shocked. He ran my column on the front page of the News Signal. It made the editor of the Beacon so mad, he said he was removing me as news editor, was going to move my column to once every 2 weeks and so forth. And I said, "No, you're not," because I quit. I wasn't getting paid anyway. But then I went up and told Guy Smith, and he hired me to be a full-time reporter for the Knoxville Journal. And I did that my senior year at UT. And I was so proud of being a bag boy at the A&P. I thought I might make my career at A&P. Then I worked my first 2 years at UT as a salesman at Sears. I was so proud of that. I thought Sears was such a great company. And I never will forget, after I'd been at Sears 6 months and I didn't realize that, I got called to the office and it scared me to death. I met this boy, David Weaver from Central High School, who was my same age. He'd been called to the office. And I told him, I said, "I bet I've been hit by one of those Hallmark shoppers, which were mystery shoppers for Sears." And he said, well, he just had a woman call him and bawled him out for selling her the wrong color paint. And he said, "I'm scared," and he said, "I've got diabetes. When I get too nervous, I pass out." And we were both about to stroke out. They called us up there to tell us they were giving us a nickel an hour raise from $1.25 an hour to $1.30 an hour. I'll never forget that day. But I loved that job. I loved being a reporter for the Sentinel. For the Journal. I thought about making my career at that. Then I was admitted to go to law school at George Washington full-time. But then my sister Becky saw that they had a teacher shortage in Alexandria, despite being the highest paid system in the state. And one thing they needed was a journalism teacher. Well, just out of curiosity, I went and talked to them, and they hired me to teach American government and journalism at the biggest public high school in Virginia. And I switched to the night law school, went to law school 5 nights a week. And at the end of that year, I told my dad, because I was about worn out, I was going 5 nights a week plus 3 hours on Saturday morning. I said, I believe I'm gonna give up this law school and just teach. And he said, that conversation, it lasted 10 seconds. And that was the best decision I reluctantly gave up the teaching job, which I loved, and went so I could go to law school full-time and finish up faster. And then I came back and went into practice with Zane Daniel. And if any of you who didn't know Zane, you missed a real character. But the juries fell in love with him, and it was just me and him, Daniel and Duncan, and it was fascinating. And Brett, my very first case, and this is unheard of, the only one I've ever known whose first case was a murder case was my cousin Vinny. My first case out of law school was a first-degree murder case. Mose Lobetty, who Brian mentioned, ran a liquor store in East Knoxville. He sent a black woman who had killed her husband. And the one thing they don't teach in law school is how much to charge. And so I talked to this woman and her brother for about an hour, and then finally they wanted to know how much I was going to charge them. I reared back and threw out, I said, I'm going to charge you $500 for the preliminary hearing and another $250 if it goes on for a full-scale trial in the big criminal court. You got to realize, though, this is 53 years ago. Zane came back in a few minutes, and I said, Zane, how much would you charge for a first-degree murder case? He said, well, you got to do all this work, blah, blah, blah. He said, I'd probably charge at least $15,000. Well, I knew I had messed up bad. Well, then I said, well, what if you knew the people? Which I didn't know those people, but I did know the man who'd sent them to me, and I was looking for something to say. And he said, well, if I knew the people, he said, I might come down to 10,000, but you got to do all this blah, blah work. And I said, well, what if it was your first case? And that was my first case, and it had a Perry Mason ending. We got through the preliminary hearing, and every first-degree murder case I've ever heard of has been bound over to the grand jury at that point. This man stood up in the audience and said, Judge, can I say something? And it was the last case of the day, and that judge was in a good mood, and he said, come forward. And the man came forward, and he had a soft Scottish hat on his chest, and he was standing there, and he told about this man, how violent he was, how cruel he was, how he beat this woman, and he went on and on and on. And the judge shocked everybody and dismissed the case. And that's unheard of. And then I found out my second lesson, in criminal cases, you're supposed to get your feet up front. Anyway, and then I had, for a little over 8.5 years, I had a fascinating law practice. I handled everything from a dog bite case to murders, and had one man built his house on the wrong piece of property. I came back early from my honeymoon 2 nights at Gatlinburg to represent a man who had gone through a sex change operation to get his name changed. Then he married my first Little League baseball coach. And then they came to me and had a 10-year-old woman who wanted to give him her 10-year-old son, and I did the adoption. And then 40 years later, I got a call in my marital office, and it said so-and-so, and I said, I wonder if that's the woman that did the sex change, and sure enough, it was. And she was having a problem, and I said, well, we handled that in the Knoxville office. She said, honey, get mommy a pen. She said, I've got a 10-year-old grandson, but that boy you helped me adopt all those years ago. And I thought, boy, everything you read about or hear about happening in New York or Los Angeles, it'll probably has happened in Knoxville, Tennessee. Anyway, I will say this. So I had a fascinating law practice. Then I became judge of the criminal court, and we tried jury trials every single day, and it was a different time. And I tried the attempted murder of James Earl Ray. I had a lot of high-profile cases. And then I got, thanks to the good people of East Tennessee, I got to spend 30 years in Washington. And if somebody told me the day I graduated from law school that I was going to have the law practice and the judgeship and the times in Congress, I wouldn't have believed it. I just was so blessed, and I am very, very grateful to the people of East Tennessee. I emphasized, as most of you know, Lamar Alexander came to me in early 2014 and asked me to be his campaign manager for his last campaign, because I had a reputation as being the most conservative member of the Tennessee delegation. I emphasized fiscal conservatism and a peaceful foreign policy, non-intervention foreign policy, and trying to help people. I tried to help as many people as I could for as long as I could, and I was grateful for the opportunities. I've written this book, and the book is about 160 pages. It's 203 vignettes, stories. It's not ghostwritten. Every story is straight from me, and it's about half of them are serious, half of them are humorous, and all of them are true. There is one thing in the book that this one little boy wrote to me and wanted to know if he got 2 million signatures, could I do away with homework? And he wrote this letter: homework is making life at home not fun for many kids. Teachers are just giving way too much. If I get 2 million people to sign, please ban homework. Not only does it really mess with our schedules, family life, and morals, but it seems to cause a lot of stress. I recommend you limit it, ban it on Wednesday, or just get rid of it. That's part of it. The rest of that letter is in the book, and along with a lot of other stories. I did have a man named Ryan Gerdusky, who I sometimes see on TV being interviewed. He was a reporter from New York, and he wrote a really nice article. Let's see. Oh wait, here's. He wrote an article in the Week magazine, a national news magazine, at the tail end of my time in office, and he entitled it Jimmy Duncan, the hero America ignored. And I don't feel at all that I was ignored, because I was a very unusual member in that I don't think I hardly ever put out a press release. I didn't think my job that I should spend my time trying to get publicity for myself. I wanted to spend it trying to do as much for my district and my people as I could. But he wrote, but I did speak out in committee and on the floor, and I wrote many articles and columns over the years for national publications and others. But he wrote this. He said, Duncan belongs to a brand of conservatism that dates back to the Eisenhower era, one that regularly opposed both the military-industrial complex and big business. He looked out for the interests of Main Street instead of Wall Street, and voted to protect America's liberty and security at home instead of traveling the world in search of monsters to destroy. Other Republicans used to believe in the same things Duncan advocates. They should have been paying attention to Jimmy Duncan quietly, and all this time they had in front of them a man who showed bravery, conviction, and dedication to the idea of limited government at home and abroad. And I really appreciate that article. I thought he summed up my career maybe even better than I could. I cast 16,000 votes in my 30 years in Congress. Every one of them, I can tell you, made somebody mad. You find out that even some vote that seems to be a very meaningless vote. But after my first election, the lowest total I ever got was in the election that Ryan mentioned. This man ran full-time against me for 13 months, and I got 72%. 94, which was a big Republican year, I got 90.5%. And I always had opponents, because Tennessee has the easiest qualifying in the entire nation, 25 signatures and no money. So every election I had opposition. But another reporter, author, Bill Kaufman, also a New York man, he had followed my career, and he brought me something one time. He said he thought this that this was like my career, and it's a quote from a 1930 novel called The Lion's Den by Janet Eyre Fairbank. It says, no matter how the espousal of a lost cause might hurt his prestige in the House, Zimmer had never hesitated to identify himself with it, if it seemed to him to be right. He knew only two ways, the right one and the wrong. And if he made a mistake, it was never one of honor. He voted as he believed he should. And although sometimes his voice was raised alone on one side of a question, it was never stifled. And I liked that when he gave me that, and I put it on, I had it hanging on the wall in my Knoxville office. I've gone far longer than I meant to. I will tell you that a lot of most people, probably most of the voters now, were not voting when my dad was still alive, because my dad's been dead for 40 years now. But I can tell you, no son could have ever been more proud than I was of my dad. Some of you know that Daddy, my grandparents were really good people, but they had 10 kids in an outhouse and not much more. Daddy hitchhiked in here with $5 in his pocket to go to UT and worked his way through UT, and then he became mayor. He became a prosecuting assistant district attorney, and then he became law director, then he became mayor. He led the peaceful integration of Knoxville. In his last race for mayor, you'd be interested in this, he ran against two really tough opponents. Bill Talent, who had been elected county finance commissioner 2 or 3 times, countywide, and Lowell Blanchard, who was the voice of the Vols basketball team. And in the black precincts, one of I remember in particular, College Homes gave him, I think it was like 550 votes for Daddy, 32 for Bill Talent, 25 for Lowell Blanchard. It's unheard of for a Republican to win 90% of the black vote, but they really loved my dad as I did. I described him in an article for the News Sentinel a few years ago as the kindest, sweetest, toughest, hardest working man I ever knew. And I meant tough in a good way. The best example I can give you is 55 years ago or whatever, when I was in basic training for the Army. When we got to Fort Campbell, we found out we were between cycles, and that meant we got 2 extra weeks of basic training, 10 weeks instead of 8, and that was not good news. After 3.5 weeks, the drill sergeant sent me to run an errand for him, and I passed by a phone booth, and I thought, I'm gonna call home. I was homesick and not liking it. I'd been there 3.5 weeks. I called, and luckily and unluckily, I got my dad, and I said, boy, I hate this Army. I hate everything about it, from the generals right on down. He says, is that all you called about? Blam. He hung that phone up. That was the shortest phone call in the history of the world. I walked out of that phone booth feeling as low as it's possible for a human being to feel. But I've thought 1,000 times since then that was the best thing he could have done. Thank you very much for listening to me. I'm sorry I've talked too long, but if anybody's got any questions, I'll be glad to.
What years did you work at the A&P? Do you remember?
Yes, I was working there in 1964 and 65. I was working there, like I said, I sent my $19 and some odd cents to the Barry Goldwater.
And you know, this is a Barry Goldwater guy over here too, David Williams.
The reason I ask is my mom and stepdad worked there.
Yeah. His granddad was my bailiff, Sheeny White.
Really? All right.
When I was judge.
Sean?
Mr. Duncan, question. Do you think the Republican Party of today can get back to the Republican Party of 1994?
Oh, wow.
Well, I guess that depends on what you mean by getting
The
back.
contract with America was in Gene and Stockton, and it was a great, I was in high school at the time, and it was a great
Gosh,
document.
that makes me feel
led.
old.
It was really good stuff, and since you were in Congress then, I'm just curious.
Well,
If we could get back, if you could ever get back.
yes, I'll explain to you this way. After Barack Obama won, Howard Baker wrote a column in the Washington Post in which he said, those who say the Republican Party is dead or dying are wrong. The Republicans will come back stronger than ever, either because the Obama administration will, how was he put it? It will either overpromise or underachieve. And see, the reason I say yes is because my dad was first elected to Congress in 1964. Goldwater was slaughtered. The Republicans lost. When my dad was sworn into Congress, there were 295 Democrats to 140 Republicans. There were so many empty seats on the Republican side that my brother Joe and my Iowa grandfather, Papa Swisher, got to stand with my dad when he was sworn in. But in '66, we came back and picked up 47 seats in the House, and so forth. And I saw that happen so many times. We come along and we lost. Well, Lyndon Johnson had become so unpopular in those first 2 years. And the same thing happened. Bill Clinton wins in '92. He becomes so unpopular. What happens? '94, we elect the Speaker of the House. Then Obama gets elected in 2008. We come along and he's so unpopular after 2 years, we come back and elect the Speaker in 2010. The pendulum swings in politics. It always has and it always will. But I will say this, you are exactly right talking about Connecticut and the relationship here. I have written several columns pointing out that that people are fleeing these Democrat-run cities and states as fast as they can get out. And I've challenged in columns and otherwise for any Democrat to explain to me that if their policies are so good, why are so many people trying to get away from them? And 45% of the people in this world have to get by on $4 or less a day. Slightly over 70% have to get by on less than $10 a day. People are fleeing socialist-run countries all over the world. And now, the worst thing that we could do is elect a socialist party, which the Democrats, and I've never been mean to anybody. I always tried to help a Democrat just as hard as I would a Republican, because I used to say I had 750,000 bosses. But I can tell you, I hope that we don't be foolish enough to elect socialists to run this government, because if we do, we will go down, down, down.
You got any thoughts on what happened to Thomas Massey?
Oh, well, it's I don't know of hardly any member of Congress, any Republican that could fight that much money. Yeah. I mean, they said they know of 32 million, which I always said, my first year that I ran for Congress, '88, the most money that was spent on a congressional race was $750,000, and that was by a Republican in West Virginia who lost. Wow. And my whole time, people thought 2 or 3 million was an unbelievable amount to spend. I will tell you one last unusual story that happened on election night. Channel 10 was getting ready to interview me and I was to make my victory statement. And I'm standing there with a Channel 10 reporter, and then we're up on this stage, and this man pulls on my pants, and he says, Judge Duncan, he said, I don't know how to tell you this, but said, I'm from the Associated Press, and said, our totals show you way behind. And I turned to Bob Gross, I said, Bob, go see what he's talking about. Well, what happened, the Associated Press, for 45 minutes between 10:30 and 11:15, reversed the totals.
Oh, wow.
And the early edition of the Washington Post had me losing and so forth. But fortunately, they found out their mistake, and plus, the other thing was all the official election commissions had the correct totals, and it got straightened out. But that's a very unusual thing to have happen to you on election night.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to me.
All right, did everybody that wanted a ticket buy a ticket?